All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Jane writes, when conversing with opposing views, how does one avoid becoming entangled by a web of words? Example, Marxist language. This is a very good question, and it maybe gets to the heart of the problem, not just that philosophy is trying to address, but also some of the problems with philosophy itself. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's talk about people like Marxists, which is not just Marxists. It also applies to Christians, libertarians, basically any ideology. Anyone with a particular worldview and an axe to grind about it, a proselytizing instinct, can fall into this tricky way of trying to capture you with language. Now, there are many different ways in which we can be entangled with words. I think it's worth highlighting three. First, there is semantic entanglement, i.e. we're caught in some kind of equivocation, which is where we use a word in two different senses interchangeably. Two, we can be entangled emotionally. This is when people get triggered, right? People say something that gets into our gears emotionally, and we can no longer think straight. But third, or it draws us in. Well, it's the same thing. We can no longer think straight. Either it says something that offends you, or it says something that triggers your sympathy. You see a dead child, and you're like, oh, I'll do whatever policy it takes to stop. Anyways, so there's semantic entanglement, there's emotional entanglement, and there's something that's kind of similar sounding to semantic entanglement, but it's different. I'm going to call it philosophical entanglement. That's the third one. So semantic, emotional, and philosophical. Philosophical entanglement is where the deployment of the word, of a particular word or phrase, causes us to presuppose the importance of the thing or phrase. And there are, and all three of these are kind of related to each other, right? Equivocation, for example, can lead to illusions of importance by loading a single term with a lot of different meanings. And so as you load more meanings into a single term, suddenly that single term increases in import, and you begin to think this is like what it's all about. And the importance can lead to being triggered or emotionally entangled if someone denies this. And you see this when people in the Christian world and also classical liberals will get this way about truth. Oh, you're denying the concept of truth itself, and it was like their head explodes. Or denying the idea of good and evil. People will hear something being denied, and suddenly it emotionally entangles them in an interesting way. So when we think about these three, semantic entanglement, emotional entanglement, and philosophical entanglement, that happens through language. If we can, because these are all related to each other and they play into each other, if we can learn how to avoid one, then we're already one step in the direction of avoiding the others. And I'll bring up an example here, since Jane brings up Marxist language as an example, which is a very good example. We can use a Marxist term to sort of flesh this out. So let's talk about the word racism. Now, this is not an orthodox Marxist term. This is a much more new generation American Marxist term. But it exemplifies all of the things here. So racism can mean many different things, some of which are exclusive, at the same time. It shouldn't mean them at the same time, but that's how it's used, right? It can mean, and I listed off a few examples here. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is a pretty good starting list. A generalized judgment of individuals, i.e., saying person X is like Y because they're in Y category. A disdain or hatred of others according to their category, which is not the same as a generalized prejudgment, because a generalized prejudgment could be good or neutral. Unfair outcomes according to category and categorization. Unequal outcomes according to category or categorization, which is not the same as unfair, unequal and unfair. Systems or structures which result in unfair outcomes according to categorization. Systems or structures which result in unequal outcomes according to categorization. And even, possibly, we'll throw in the seventh one just for fun, an individual benefiting from systems or structures which we deem to be racist according to the previous two items. You know, the systems or institutions that result in unfair or unequal outcomes. So, in other words, racism can refer to the state of someone's mind or the complete absence of mental awareness of the benefits that someone is receiving. Both of those could be considered racist, even though they are not just different, but in a sense almost completely opposite meanings. So that's an equivocation setup. We could, when this is done intentionally or strategically, we call it a Mott and Bailey, where you have a broad, expansive term, but then when you're challenged, you retreat back to your defensive stronghold term. But that's just a fancy word for equivocation. So we've got an equivocation context set up. We've primed for ourselves for equivocation with the loading of this term with many different meanings. And that equivocal setup, this semantic entanglement that we've created, lends itself to great moral import. In other words, philosophical entanglement, because racism seems to connect with everything. It seems to be the ordering structure of our country, because we've created a bunch of definitions for one term. So we can find now racism as if it's one thing in everything and in everyone. And this equivocation makes it philosophically significant and morally important in our head. And then, the emotional triggers, do we even need to get into it? We should, because racism and allegations of racism can trigger us emotionally in a couple of different ways. It can trigger us first by association. We can hear someone talk about racism and, like the meme of the cat reliving its previous lives, we think of slavery and all this horrible stuff in the past, though never like the North African slave trade or the current slave trades going on now. We don't think about that, but we think about horrible things in the past, and the association sort of cuts past our rational faculties into emotional association. But it can work a second way too. It can trigger us not by association, but by allegation, i.e., you can be threatened with the charge of racism, saying, oh, that's racist of you to say this or to do that. That is a threat, of course, of moral condemnation and social ostracism, of personal legal consequences, perhaps. And it can be a threat of institutional upheaval. The charge of racism can upend an entire organization as they have to deal with this claim now because of the climate we've created from this. And you'll notice that the equivocation is what makes all these things possible. The use of a single term to describe lots of different disparate things. So, if we can learn to identify equivocation, then you have the skeleton key to control your own emotions, to control your own thinking, and ideally, in the long run, to control your own values in the face of others seeking to appropriate these things in yourself. Now, how do we deal with this? How do we go about, pointing out, identifying first of all, and then pointing out equivocations, And here it's worth talking about what I think is what can be a functional route, but I think an inferior answer. And that is the temptation to dismissive non-engagement. As soon as you start to hear someone talk in terms of Marxist language, you say, oh, you're a Marxist, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to put up with this. And there's a few dangers here. The first danger is that, first of all, they might have something interesting and valuable to say. Just because someone's foundational worldview is antithetical to yours doesn't mean there's nothing you can learn from that. You might be a conservative, an anti-communist activist or, whatever. But if you think you have no points of common ground with someone like, for instance, Slavoj Žižek, you're just wrong. You haven't listened to him. Unless you have and you've thought about it, but most people haven't. So there's a danger of missing out. Two, you are actually ceding ground. You think you're marginalizing them, you're kicking them out of the conversation. But when dismissive non-engagement actually takes you out of the conversation more than them, because the conversation is happening wherever people are willing to talk together. So you don't want to disengage because you're actually giving them power in many cases. But third, and most importantly, I think, is you don't want to necessarily dismissively disengage because this is where you build your mental strength. This is where you build these cognitive muscles, your powers of thinking through these things and developing your own argumentative strength and skill and capability. And we'll get into that a little bit here. So, if dismissive disengagement is not the right path, what is the right path? And I would say what this looks like in application is channeling your inner Socrates. It's approaching these kinds of debates, these kinds of questions in the Socratic manner. Now, people talk a lot about the Socratic method as an interrogative method, but there's a shallow take on that, and there's a deeper take on what Socrates is doing. And one of the things that sticks out when you read Socrates and in his dialogues, Plato's dialogues of Socrates, is the incisive way in which he will ask questions that seek to draw out and expand upon conceptions that people have. So the Republic sort of begins at this dinner party with there's an existing idea of justice as paying your debts. Justice is giving to people what is owed to them. And Socrates says, so here's a scenario. If a man was not in his right mind, but he had loaned weapons to someone else while he was in his right mind, and then in his moment of insanity, he asked for the weapons back, would it be just to give him his weapons back? Because that is giving back what is owed. And of course, people sense that's not really what we mean by justice. It would be just according to this definition, but the example creates a reductio ad absurdum. It reveals an incompleteness in the definition being pushed. And so when you approach these terms in the Socratic fashion, and you'll notice also when you read Plato's dialogues with Socrates that Socrates is always polite and he's charitable. The the principle of charity is one of the most important principles in philosophical discussion. And the principle of charity, which is also brought up in the Republic, is always trying to give the benefit of the doubt to your interlocutor, and to assume the best, the most sensible, not necessarily the good intentions or anything like that, but the most sensible semantic interpretation of what they mean. If there is a sensible interpretation and a nonsensical interpretation, you are to try your best to presume the sensible interpretation. And he always does that, or when he doesn't, he's asking to clarify. And then when his interlocutor corrects themselves, he always accepts the correction, which is the opposite of how lawyers argue, and also the opposite of how Marxists argue, and basically anyone in the news. They'll always try to stick you to the worst possible interpretation. So, following the Socratic method, we want to be charitable and polite, but asking questions and being firm in sticking to, holding to the definitions that they provide, because it's only through that we can break the equivocation. So, for example, if someone were to say, oh, this thing that they're doing is racist, and you say, oh, interesting, okay, what do you mean when you say they're racist? Because there's a few different ways that people mean this word. And they would say, I mean it's racist in the sense that it's creating a structural inequality between outcomes between these different ethnic groups. You're like, oh, okay, so we're talking, when you say racism, you're talking about outcomes, and you're not talking at all about intentions. You're not talking at all about hatred or intergroup, discord or anything like that. And they're like, well, it can also mean that. I'm like, yes, but we're talking about what you mean in this case. But when you're talking about racism, we're talking about, are you talking about different outcomes based on, the structures and how things are run? They're like, well, yes. And you're like, okay. So we're not talking about intentions. We're talking about outcomes. And periodically remind them of that. Say, the conversation moves forward, and they've explained why this is racist because it creates different outcomes. And you're like, okay, and we've clarified that that doesn't have to do with intentions. We're talking about outcomes. Then it can become a conversation about why should outcomes be equal, and don't let them switch back. You have to remember the definition that was agreed to. And what you'll find is when you argue with people in good faith, you'll discover that good faith arguers very, very rarely hinge their arguments upon definitions, upon strict definitions. They are arguing from experiences, and they are quite happy to call a given incident or a given experience by any number of different names, so long as it can convey the experience and the knowledge of what they experienced to the listener. It is a sign of bad faith in arguing where someone insists upon a particular word and insists upon a particular definition of that word. But this works against them when you hold them to a single definition. And like I was saying before, this works not just against Marxists. It works against Christians when you talk about truth or logos or God. It works against libertarians when they talk about what is violence or the initiation of violence. And this is the secret. It actually works against basically any ideology that is trying to proselytize in this manner. Who is trying to use words to trap you and to get you to accept a particular definition, and then they've got you, and they'll either trigger you or manipulate you or get you in some kind of intellectual Chinese finger trap that you can't get out of without sounding silly or whatever. And so the method out of that is channeling your inner Socrates, being polite, asking questions, thinking laterally about proposed definitions. So think about examples of this. What would this look like in practice? And what would be a counterexample? Are there a counterexample? Think about what follows from this definition. And taking a moment to think about the definition, say, what must also be true if this is true, that we maybe weren't thinking about when we just were thinking about the words. So, and again, be charitable, but be firm, and follow from where the definitions lead to wherever they lead. And if they try some evasion, like, oh, it's not my burden to educate you, educate yourself, you can point that out and say that feels disingenuous when you're, taking the time to evangelize this to other people. Surely you have the time to explain to someone who's curious about that, and who's interested in getting things right. And once you've asked some questions, be sure to delineate the different concepts and identify them as distinct when they are called by a single equivocal term. Now, if their argument doesn't fall apart when you question and expand upon their definitions, and if they're perfectly happy to describe their argument in a number of different ways, you might be dealing with a legitimate argument, and it might be worth listening to. Doesn't make it right necessarily, but it might be worth taking seriously. And something that you thought was illegitimate might actually have something interesting to say, and you've just won because you've exposed yourself to something interesting and new and cool that you may have been closed to before. And this kind of segues into the other great value of taking this Socratic approach to dealing with poor faith actors like this too, which is that it changes how you think and how you make your own arguments. As you deal with bad faith actors and expose equivocation and the word traps that people create for themselves, when you make counter arguments, you begin subconsciously at first and then consciously over time to think about how would someone else respond to what I'm saying. And you begin to develop that Socratic daemon that says, that's not right. You're about to make an argument, and that voice in your head says, you're not doing it right. You're using a word in a little bit too slippery of a manner. You don't really believe what you're saying here, do you? You're just grabbing at arguments because you develop that power too. But as you get better at recognizing the faults in other people's arguments, you begin to police your own arguments, and you begin to get a little bit more self-critical, and you begin to think better. And what's extraordinary, what's been my experience, is on the other side of this process, you end up with a kind of skepticism of what philosophy can give you. It can be very good at identifying bullshit and helping you avoid it and call it out. But it doesn't tell you what is correct. And this was exactly Socrates' experience. The daemon never told him what to do, but it would tell him not to do things that he was supposed to do. So how do we know what to do? It comes down to experience. It comes down to doing things and seeing what works and kind of seeing what's real in the world without using language to try to deduce everything, and conversation can still help with this, but it highlights the significance of having good intentions in arguing. There's a kind of spiritual disposition, which is a genuine care for the best position that a lot of people pretend to have and maybe genuinely aspire to have, but don't quite manifest all the way. Often not for lack of effort, it takes some skill to actually apply that. And so practicing the search for equivocation by polite, charitable interrogation and expansion upon these definitions that people provide, and then properly delineating the different subcategories of concepts, all described by a single word, is the best method I know and the best method I've seen in avoiding being trapped in other people's language and in avoiding trapping yourself in language, which is as big, if not even bigger of a problem as other ideologues doing that to you. So, hope that was useful. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.